This is the lecture for music and memory and music and emotion. There's quite a bit of information in this lecture, but I'll try to get it through pretty quickly. So we're first going to talk about music and memory, and so just to talk a little bit about how memory works in the auditory system. One thing we need to understand is that memory is about encoding the information into our neural networks. And so our experiences or our interaction with information, those events in the world causes changes in the microstructure of the brain. And those connections hold the information, and they're not, they don't necessarily, it's not like you're creating a memory, like you're writing onto space that has previously not had any information. It's just reconnections of the brains, and that coding that encoding process happens within previously existing context. So your previous experience very much shades the memory that you have, and memory is therefore personalized. You can probably identify with that when you talk about certain events and you remember some things as happenings and other people remember other things as happening. And that's just because our experience very much shades our memory. So there are different types of memory, and you've probably heard of these things before, but I just want to go over just to make sure we're all on the same page. First, there's sensory memory, and this is not to be confused with short-term memory. Sensory memory is essentially, it's like your RAM if you were talking about a computer. It's kind of the memory that goes on just to make sure that you remember things are, that you know what's going on within the environment, and it doesn't necessarily go into, you're never going to use that information. So in sensory memory, you only have that for 1 to 2 seconds. A way to think about it is if you're, in the room that you're currently in, you probably know that there are objects in the room with you, but you might not know exactly. Like I'm looking into my kitchen, and I can see that there are 2 dishes in the sink. Before I directed my attention to that, I probably knew that there were things around there, but I didn't know necessarily exactly what was. And so just the fact that I remember that there's a sink and that there's stuff over there, that's that sensory memory. It's just all the stimulus that's coming in is kind of held in this gatekeeping, which you can then use that information to build more memory onto that. So if you do attend to something from your sense memory, then it can move into short-term memory, which that memory is only about 4 to 8 seconds long. And this is where you have the chance to consciously encode that memory into further longer memory. And so long-term memory is what we think of as our archival memory. It's where we keep a long-term record of what we know, what we've heard, what we've seen before. That's all long-term memory. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about working memory, and that is relating to kind of this going from the short-term memory into the long-term memory. And so when we go back into talking about sensory memory, there are 2 kinds of sensory memory. We have iconic, which that's sensory memory for visual information, and then we have echoic, ECHOIC, echoic. And that's sensory memory for auditory information. Now, the short-term memory, like I said before, that's where encoding sensory information comes in, where we actually know that something is in our environment and we're about to interact with it. And short-term memory really can't hold a lot of information. It can only hold about 7 bits of information plus or minus 2. So, and you've had this experience, or maybe you remember this experience back before we had cell phones, but you would look up a phone number and then you would kind of say it to yourself over and over and over again before you put it in. and that's kind of that working memory of trying to keep it alive in the short-term memory, because if you don't attend to it, then it goes away, and then you've got to look up the number again. Like I said before, this operates in a time span of 4 to 8 seconds, and temporal sequence is really important in short-term memory. So again, if you were trying to remember that phone number, it's not easy enough. It's hard. You can't just say, oh, I remember that there were 2 8s and 2 4s and a 3 and a 7 and a 1. Like, the way that you keep that memory salient is by thinking about that sequence. Okay, it's 8, then 4, then 2, then 3, then, like, you kind of have to do that chaining mechanism in order to keep that information there. And also, short-term memory is also helped by selecting an organized schema, or schemata. Schemata is the plural of schema. So schema is just a really fancy word for talking about categories. So the thing that we do is that we kind of place things into certain categories, and that helps us organize the information. So for instance, this isn't for instance, but this is a slightly different way that we work with short-term memory, is that we use this chunking technique where if we take information and we can organize it, then it makes it more valuable to us. We can understand it easier, and then it's more efficient for us to remember it. This normally is done visually, but I'm gonna do this orally, and we'll see if it has the same effect. So I want you to try to remember this number: 13,579,111,315. Okay, so if I asked you in 10 seconds to repeat that number, that might be a bigger challenge. But if I said, this is the order of the integers: 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, then that was probably much easier for you to remember. Oh, I just need to remember all the odd numbers up to 15. Whereas if I put them all together as one big number, 135 billion, I've already made you kind of like, that chunking doesn't work as logically and as efficiently for our brains. So when thinking about short-term memory in music and this chunking principle, both rhythm and melody structures help aid in chunking musical information into larger units. So when talking about long-term memory, we tend to think of long-term memory as the capacity is limitless, which, that's the thing, is we don't have any evidence that there is a limit to how much information we can store in our brains. Based on my experience, that doesn't feel exactly true, because I feel like, I taught high school for 10 years, and I feel like my capacity to learn names has gotten to capacity. And for every new name that I learn, I forget people's names that I don't interact with anymore. Students from 15 years ago, things like that. But like I said, it's not like we have 3 terabytes of information in our brain, and once we get to a certain point, we have to erase things. And that comes to the next point, is that duration is a variable. And so the longer, if we don't use a memory for a long time, then that memory is harder to access. As you guys well know from trying to remember things from childhood or things that you learned in high school. If I was going to talk about trigonometry right now, I definitely couldn't tell you much about it, but I spent a year of my life studying it. So anyway, long-term memory, we aren't conscious of what memories are put into long-term memory and which are, just kind of stay in short-term memory, and they don't get archived for retrieval later. And within long-term memory, we have a couple of different designations for memory. We have episodic versus semantic, and I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, especially as how it relates to music. And then we have implicit versus explicit, which was discussed a little bit in the book. But so talking about episodic and semantic, episodic memory is episodic memory for musical information refers to the capacity to recognize a musical excerpt, whether familiar or not, for which the spatio-temporal context surrounding its former encounter, i.e., when, where, and how, can be recalled. So an example of this is, you hear a song. Let's say you're in the mall. You hear a song, and you're like, I remember that was the song that I danced with, my high school sweetheart 15 years ago. And you can remember, like, the memory is paired with some sort of experience. That song that was played at our wedding, that kind of thing. Like, that's what an episodic memory is. Now, a semantic memory is, these are well-known excerpts of music stored in memory without it being possible to retrieve the temporal or spatial circumstances surrounding the encounter. So again, this is like, I know the song because I know it well. So like, you hear the beginning of Johnny Be Good. And you're like, that's Johnny Be Good. You don't say, I know that song because I love Back to the Future, and, I remember watching Back to the Future with my parents when I was a kid. Like, that would be episodic memory. Just knowing it from the basis of the music itself, that's semantic memory, which that makes sense. Semantic meaning, having meaning. So long-term memory, also we have explicit and implicit memory. And so, and this is a little more abstract to think about. So explicit memory, in the text it was talking about, Toscanini's explicit memory of music and how he was able to articulate exactly what he wanted, or what he, the memory of how something was played. So explicit memory is accessible to conscious awareness, and it can be verbalized or reproduced. Implicit memory is unconscious, it's abstract, and general knowledge of music, and it's more connected to schema, expectations driven by prior experience, the result of unconscious statistical learning. So implicit memory, I think if you think about like film music for a movie that you don't really remember things, you don't remember specific things about the music, but you remember maybe the mood that it provided or something like that. That's more implicit memory. So in some research looking at memory, they make a distinction between recall and recognition. Recall or recollection, that's retrieval from long-term memory through intentional cueing. So for instance, you're trying to, I do this all the time when I see something on TV and I'm trying to just, I say, what else do I know that guy from? I recognize that actor. And I sit there and I think, I have to think, and this is one of these things that we might be losing because of cell phones, because we automatically, look up information as opposed to trying to recall it or having recollections of the stored information. So you're actively trying to think of it. Recognition, on the other hand, is automatic activation of the long-term memory because an event acts as its own cue. So again, you're sitting in a restaurant and you hear the beginning of Johnny Be Good plays. You're like, oh, that's Johnny Be Good because I know it. Like, it's in there. It's that memory of what that song is in your head, and the beginning of the song is its own cue. So research looking into memory, which it's interesting. Like, a lot of times we use memory of music as a proxy for understanding, because it's hard for us, like especially with cultural like cross-cultural studies, it's hard to ask somebody, well, do you really understand the music? So a lot of researchers, they use memory as a way of as a proxy for understanding. And so um, researchers that have looked at musical memory, they find that there are certain variables that are highly influential in whether someone is able to remember them or not. Looking at melodic memory, and this kind of goes back to some of the stuff we already have talked about with melody, crucial elements in remembering melodies are the contour, the interval, and the key. So, if someone can't remember the contour, that's kind of the basic level. And then intervals are a little more easy if there are if there is some sort of change in interval, that's a little more easier to hear than contour. I mean, it's easier to hear than a key difference where it's the interval is essentially the same, but you're in the wrong key. That was confusing. So we have contour, interval, and key, and that's the order of discrimination. If there is incongruence in the contour, that's the easiest thing to hear. If there's a change in the interval, that's harder to hear than contour, but easier to hear than change of key. And change of key, where it's the interval's the same, but you're using a different mode, and so like it's like if everything's up a step, it could be that the intervals have changed. The intervals are essentially the same, but the key is no longer congruent. Melodic memory can function differently depending on the stimulus length. This makes sense, right? If you give a short sequence, that's easier to remember than if you give a long sequence, just because there's less information to hear. So we're going to listen to. Here is a example of a short sequence. If I find it, here we go. All right, so that's an easier task than this. Right? So the length of the sequence. Well, another variable that influences performance on memory tasks is also the length of delay. So here is a long sequence with a longer delay. Okay, so like I said, that's oops, that's not my notes. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so also how well we know a piece, if we know a piece really well, we are very likely to notice if there's a wrong note in it. I mean, that's just basic logic. And there were studies to show that's true. So here's an example of that. So yeah, so your error detection is really, it's activated right when you hear a note that does not conform to what you're expecting to hear. It kind of goes back to what we talked about as far as when we were talking about relative, absolute pitch and relative pitch a couple of lectures ago. And if you remember, there was a study where they took people and they had them listen to popular songs that were on the radio, and they altered whether up or down a half step. I think they maybe even in a whole tone. So several different versions. A whole step apart, half step apart, that kind of thing. And the participants were really, really accurate at knowing which one was the real key. So again, it shows that we kind of have, even though by and large humans have this relative key, that we hear songs. We're like transposing songs really doesn't bother us. But when we have these artifacts, these high fidelity recordings of things that we hear over and over and over again, that becomes pretty permanent in our brain, and we can notice when there's some sort of violation from those recordings. So identification of well-known songs. A researcher named White, he showed that melodies could be distorted in a variety of ways, and people would still recognize them, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. And then Ibert and Peretz, they showed how pitch versus rhythm cues, or pitch cues, are much more helpful than rhythm cues in identifying familiar melodies, and you're going to see that in just a second. So you're going to do some name that tune. First, you are only going to hear pitch. So name these tunes. Okay, so you there might be one more. Okay, so I probably forgot the order now. I think it was Happy Birthday, then Frere Jacques, then this is a memory test in itself. My Country 'Tis of Thee was last. Jingle Bells. So yeah, Jingle Bells was the third one. All right, so with only the pitch, it's pretty easy to identify those things. Now let's do some name that tune, but we only get rhythm. I want to listen to the third one again. Sorry. Okay. I didn't look these up. I forgot to look them up before I started recording. So the first one was Jingle Bells. The second one I think was Frere Jacques. I don't know what the third one was. And then I think it's My Country 'Tis of Thee. If you figured it out, email me and let me know. So yeah, I mean, this just goes to show that that the pitch information is so much more helpful as far as helping us remember what these tunes are. Activating that that recognition. So we're now going to, again, this is going to just further belabor that point. This is going to be the right pitch, but the wrong rhythm. Okay, and so now and these are, again, this is really difficult. It's the right rhythm, but wrong pitch, and it's so hard to hear just the rhythm without the pitch. Let's listen to those again. The second one is My Country 'Tis of Thee, but the first one I thought was Happy Birthday, but let me listen again. No. If you can figure that first one out, let me know that too. Okay. All right. Here we go. Okay, and then I'm just going to mention expectancy for just a second, just because as we start talking about music and emotion, expectancy is a part of that, and so there are three different ways to think about or three types of expectancy. Where we expect, literally how we expect the music to go. And schematic expectancy is based on prior knowledge of music in general, and it's an implicit way of understanding the music. So, for instance, a, a way to think about schematic expectancy is if you think you're coming up to a cadence, and all of a sudden you get a deceptive cadence. You were expecting it to go to a 1 and it went to a 6 chord, and so that's all based on your understanding of music, but not the particular piece. Veridical expectancy, that's VERIDICAL, veridical expectancy is your understanding of how the music is supposed to go because of your interaction with that music, and that's explicit. So if you've listened to a recording a lot of times, or you've played a piece a lot of times, you know how the music's supposed to go. So if you hear a wrong note, you're like, oh, that's veridical expectancy. That's not what you expected to hear, because that's because of your repeated exposure to that piece. Dynamic expectancy, this is when local events occurring in the moment can affect your expectancy. So, it could be that you notice that, um, you're watching a performance and you notice a player falls down. That's a very dramatic example. But what you see happening, you realize that that's going to affect the sound. That's going to affect the what comes next. And so that's an example of dynamic expectancy. Yeah, and that is music and memory. So now we're going to change gears and go to music and emotion. And one of the things that's hard when talking about music and emotion is that we have to define what emotion is. And there's a lot of different ways to think of what emotions are. Some people think about affect, you're like some sort of response. Some people see it as mood, as far as, just kind of as an emotional state that you're in. Other people look at arousal. Some people think about emotion as being an aesthetic response. And then other people look at emotion being some sort of preference to a musical stimulus. And so we've been thinking about musical emotions for a long time, emotion and music for a very long time. I skipped some stuff. Let me go back. So so a way to conceptualize music and emotion, there's definitely kind of a camp of researchers that look at how are emotions expressed in music, and that's kind of when we talk about Hefner and Jeslin's, their circumplex and all that kind of thing. It's about our emotions being expressed. And then there's the induction of emotions, which that normally has to deal more with looking at physiological responses. We'll talk about all of that. So, as I said before, we've been thinking about music and emotion for a long time. And in the 17th and 18th century, we had the doctrine of affections, stemming from the Baroque period. And it was believed that certain keys and certain progressions kind of symbolized certain emotions. And from that, we have these musical expectancies, which we just were talking about with, from a memory standpoint. But the idea is that expectancy very much impacts our emotional state. And that prepares the listener for some sort of emotion, inducing an emotion. And in the book, it does this in a different chapter, a chapter that we haven't read, but it alludes to these two different camps where the cognitivist and the emotivist camps of musical meaning and emotion in music. And the emotivist camp believes that if you play music, like if there's a certain musical stimulus that is presented to people, then it will induce an emotion in them. And that's very much the Baroque idea. If you play these chords, then people will feel jubilant or they will feel anger. And that's what Cook, in the text Cook's whole idea is that, these things mean anger because, all these pieces that have the dies irae, have all these patterns that are the same, it induces anger. Well, as the writers of the textbook says, well, maybe it's the other way around, that all these composers use these similar patterns and that now we associate that with anger because we've been conditioned to do that. So it's kind of chicken the egg situation. So that is the emotivist camp. And the cognitivist camp is really more that the brain, whatever emotional response people have, it's because the brain is doing it. And the brain, um, you know, there's a lot of different ways the brain um, could make sense of the musical stimulus. And so you got that a little bit in the text, but it wasn't exactly clear. And so um, I wanted to clarify that. So, in the communication of emotion, and you'll remember there was this diagram of this in the book, that it's very important for the performer to, it's kind of a Venn diagram, that the performer, um, they first need to perform the appropriate um, emotional tone of the music in order to communicate it. And then they do this through code usage, which is a complex multidimensional set of codes, often guided by performers' overarching goal, not specific technical goals. And if you remember, there was all those, there were all these kind of descriptors of what the music should sound like. It's for happy, you could have, a light touch, or fast tempo, appropriate staccato at places, that kind of thing. But for the community, and this is how it's true with all communication, it can't be one-way street. Like the listener also has to be able to receive the cues, and that's one thing where we kind of assume that music is the universal language, and maybe that's not quite as accurate as we think it is. So not only does the player have to present the musical cues, but the listener also has to be able to interpret them. They have to be able to read the performer's intent and understand the acoustical cues. And then the listener has to integrate all that to understand the emotion that's being communicated. So there was a study that really kind of looked at this. It's Jocelyn and Locke, so in 2000, and they took 8 guitarists and matched for playing ability and assigned to either a treatment group or control group. And what they did was they played short pieces with certain emotional qualities. 3 melodies that evoked happiness, sadness, anger, or fear. And then all these performances were judged by 50 listeners to decide which emotion was ascribed to that melody. So the treatment group, they received a treatment called cognitive feedback training based on cue analysis and listener responses. So essentially what happened was they were taught to listen to the cues, or to identify cues within the music that could help interpret what the emotional messages were. What was it? Happy, sad, angry, or fearful music. And what they found was after that control group, the treatment group, that they performed 50% better on identifying the emotion within it after they had been given this training. So the implication there is that while people are okay at figuring out the emotions that are held within music, that understanding those cues is actually a learned behavior. And that's something that we a lot of times take for granted. Like I said, we like to think that just being human, you can easily identify the emotions within music. There's also this thing called the cue redundancy model, which again, and this was done to really look at cross-cultural emotion recognition um, within music, and it's kind of it's a Venn diagram. So you have a familiar system and an unfamiliar system, and each the cues are um, the musical cues for understanding emotion are, there's some overlap, and so if that overlap is enough information, then people can get the emotional content of foreign music, and that's we talked about this a little bit when we were doing cross cultural studies, or talking about cross cultural studies in music. And so, if you remember when we were talking about then, that things like tempo and loudness and timbre, like those are things that kind of um, that are in that Venn diagram, like the consensus in both parts, but things like scale or that would be in the unfamiliar part of the Venn diagram. So that's the cue redundancy model. So I skipped over talking about Hefner and Hefner. So remember Hefner, she had people look at different listen to different music and ascribe adjectives to it, and she created this circumplex where it kind of there are all these different adjectives for describing music, and then the same idea and created this axis where you had um, um, you had balance, whether it was positive or negative, happy or gloomy. It's kind of like what that axis would be. And then you have activity, which is this um, high activity or low activity. And so then you had within that you were able to kind of describe the different pieces and then kind of the musical traits that go along with it. Let's see, that's all on page 267. Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty interesting to see that, and I mean, the thing that I think is interesting too is some of them are in different places, but they're kind of on the same, like they're in the same area. So like, um, fast, um, abrupt tone attacks. I had examples earlier today where they were, but you can just see these different musical um, descriptors or for music of different emotional that are trying to express different emotional responses or communicate different emotions. Um, so looking at trying to induce emotions in people, researchers have really looked at physiological responses, and that includes measurement of the heart rate and blood pressure, galvanic skin response. Um, they've also looked at scanning, neurological measures, EEG, EMG, PET, and fMRI. Um, um, Yeah, and one of the things in the text that it really talks about is that so when they're asking people to respond to their emotions, there have been two kind of methodological ways that they've done that. They've either done it continuously, where they have like a slider scale, and they say like, oh, this is making me feel, positive, and this is making me feel negative, that kind of thing. Some sort of something on a scale, but it's continuously done with a dial throughout. Or they ask them to reflect back on it and ask them, how they felt with it. And the research seems to show that when they do that during when they do it continuously during the music, it seems to reflect their physiological responses. They can see when people get chills, or they can, when their heart beat is increasing, that sort of thing. But when they ask people to do it reflectively, it's not nearly as reliable. It's not. It doesn't seem to correlate with their physiological responses. So it seems to show that our reflections are not nearly as accurate as doing it in the moment, which makes sense, right? So we're going to talk really, really briefly about music and film. The main thing that I want you to understand about music and film is just that idea of diegetic music and non-diegetic music. So diegetic music is when the music would naturally happen within the scene that you're seeing. So, if music is being played on a jukebox, or is being played through the car stereo, or there's a live band. So going back to the Future, and when Michael J. Fox plays Johnny Be Good at the dance, that's diegetic music, right? Like the music they're hearing, everyone in the scene is hearing. Non-diegetic music is a soundtrack. It's something that the audience can hear, but the characters can't. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting about what, looking at those different scenes from the Minority Report, which even that is really, really dated now. Yeah, Minority Report came out in 2002. That's a long time ago. Yeah, so like I think, and they talk about empathetic and anempathetic music, things that kind of don't, if they're not congruent. I think a really great example of that, and this is also a dated film now, but if you've seen John Woo's Face Off, John Travolta and Nicolas Cage, there's this fight scene where there's a kid in the room, like this, like I really don't remember much about the plot other than there's a face transplant, which is completely ridiculous. But anyway, so essentially these two gangs, two sets of forces, they enter this room and they all draw their guns and they start shooting at each other. And there's a kid in the room, and so like I think it's Gina Gershon. I'm impressed if that's true. But she takes I guess it's her son, and she takes headphones and she puts them on the boy and like tries to like snatch him away and protect him. And so he's listening to Over the Rainbow, and so it's like this really slow orchestral version of Over the Rainbow, and then you see everyone in slow motion shooting at each other. So again, that's an example of anempathetic music, because you would think it would be more rousing and kind of crazy music, but it's something completely opposite. And the example of Moon River, which is a Johnny Mercer song, by the way, that's another example of anempathetic music. So yeah, so that's that. That was kind of the short version of this information. And yeah, email me if you have any questions. I hope things are going well. Talk to you later.